Welcome, everyone, to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. My name is James Walker. I'm the co-founder of the book club. We've been going about 6 years now. I am president of a Christian organization called Watchman Fellowship, an apologetics ministry focusing primarily on interfaith evangelism. We are very interested also, though, in atheism, agnostic, these types of topics. What we do at the club is we've been meeting in person initially, and now almost exclusively by Zoom, is that we get together for a friendly conversation with atheists and Christians, discussing books from each of those points of view. We alternate typically atheist book one month, Christian book the next month, and we've been really thankful to be able to have, in most cases, the author of the book with us to give us some insights. And our other co-founder is going to be here running a little bit late. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist. We'll talk with him here in a little bit. But I'm very excited with our guest today. Let me take a moment and introduce her to you. Dr. Kelsey Johnson is an educator, artist, author, speaker, and mother. She earned her BA in physics from Carleton College and her MS and PhD in astrophysics from the University of Colorado. She's professor of astronomy at University of Virginia, a former president of American Astronomical Society, and founder of the award-winning Dark Skies Bright Kids program. And before we get through with the club, I do want her to talk about that a little bit and why dark skies are so important. She's won numerous awards for her research, teaching, and promotion of science literacy. This month, in this meeting, we're going to be discussing her book, Into the Unknown, The Quest to Understand the Mysteries of the Cosmos. Well, Kelsey, it's exciting to think we're going to finally unravel all those mysteries in the next hour and a half or so, and so we're excited about buckling our seatbelt and doing that. But welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. I love that you're doing this, and I think it's great to have this cross-cultural, I don't know what to call it, exchange of ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, it came out of a year that I was invited to attend the Metroplex Atheist Fellowship, and I got to meet some great people there, and they were very friendly, and got to know them. We talked about everything from the Kalam cosmological argument to the Dallas Cowboys and everything else in between. Got to know them, and out of that relationship, for about a year, I guess it was 6 years ago, we started the book club, and just uh, it helps, I think, to we're as Christians, I'm a Christian, we're trying to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ, but it's what you find is for any kind of relationship, you're going to reach more people by talking with them than talking about them. And you also you'll have I will have misconceptions about what people think and believe, even if you just read the books. It's different when you talk to them and get to know them. And we are not just club members together; we are friends at this point. And some of the people in this room go back, for just about the whole 6 years of doing this. So uh, I want to start off with a question. I know. Bill, our other co-founder, has some questions for you when he gets in the room here later. But one of our previous guest authors was Lawrence Krauss, and in passing, we were talking about other things, but we were talking about his book, A Universe from Nothing, and he talked
Hmm.
about, I think it was under the multiverse concept, but he talked about string theory briefly. And he mentioned that the math involves the allowing for the possibility of additional dimensions. I can't remember if it was a dozen or so additional dimensions. And then it seems to make the math really works at that point. I couldn't really tell how much of a fan he was of it because it was an aside that he said. But you had numerous references in your book and discussions about string theory and dimension. So my question for you, you talked about in relationship to black holes and in your chapter on other dimensions. Um, Can you review for us exactly what string theory is? And you did mention it, not technically, it's not a theory, but explain that to us. And then about the possibility of other dimensions and why is that important?
Ooh, you're right. We should really call it the string hypothesis, right? Because a theory means a whole thing scientifically. We don't need to worry about jargon. Let's be sort of jargon free. But um, so string theory at its core is trying to explain some things that are currently unexplainable. And it does this by positing that at the most microscopic isn't even the right word for it because micro means 10 to the minus 6, and we're going much, much, much lower than that. But at the most fundamental level, what we perceive as particles in the universe are actually at, almost quantum scales, vibrations of energy. And that the mode of vibration, how these things vibrate, like if you could envision like a stringed instrument, and how those strings vibrate determines the tone of the instrument. In a similar way, how the strings of string theory vibrate would determine the properties of the particle. The catch is that for this theory to work, there have to be extra dimensions that are called compactified. So super, 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 super small, like Planck scale small. And we have not yet been able to probe those in any kind of physical lab. So we have to have these extra compactified dimensions, and we have to have something that's vibrating. And we think of that as energy, but what form that energy takes, I think, is still a little bit elusive. Now, I realize as I'm talking about this, and hopefully many of you are thinking this, like this just sounds like crazy speculation, right? Physicists got out of the wrong side of bed one morning and we're just thinking crazy thoughts. And I would be 100% with you, except that this turns out to be so incredibly predictive and have such, it's one of these things that you will appreciate if you're coming from a religious perspective, that is so beautiful and so perfect mathematically that it's almost as if it has to be true. And so there's almost kind of a divide among scientists between those who really do have I would call it a religious perspective about string theory, that it is so perfect and so beautiful that it has to be true, and those that are like, well, yeah, but it's not testable. And if it's not testable, we can't give it very much credibility. And so there very much is that divide in the community. Um, but it does raise this topic of other dimensions, which gets woven through physics and astrophysics in a variety of ways. And the idea that there could be other dimensions is very much on the table. And I know that it sounds like science fiction, and in some sense, we could think of it as fiction because it's not currently testable, but it's not currently testable. And there are actually experiments on the table that might be able to help us probe both compactified extra dimensions, so much smaller than we're currently able to perceive, and macroscopic extra dimensions, so that are unfolded in the same way as the dimensions of space that we interact with. And there are a variety of
Is
reasons
the
why we might.
difficulty because we can't access? Is it similar to the problem of multiverse that by nature we can't leave our universe to go observe? You can't. It doesn't seem scientific almost. It seems more philosophical.
Mhm.
So is that
Yeah,
similar? And plus, you have the idea with the other dimensions of you can't. At least I could fathom the concept of another universe. I can't. I can't wrap my mind around what another dimension would be. You know what I mean?
I, I totally know what you mean. And there are good reasons for that, right? Our brains have evolved, and we as people have evolved to live in a four-dimensional universe with three dimensions of space and the one of time. And so there are real reasons why it is hard, if not impossible, for us to visualize other dimensions. There's actually there have been psychology experiments on this to see if humans could do it. But one of the issues at play is that of our known forces, we have four known forces. And I want to emphasize known because there may be some forces we don't know yet, but of the four known forces, um, they are what enable us to interact with things in the universe. And if those forces don't interact with something or aren't able to reach something, we have no means to interact with it. And so if there are these other dimensions, whether they're the big macroscopic ones or the tiny compactified ones, if we don't have a way to probe them with our known forces, we don't have a way to interact with them, and we're kind of stuck in our 3 dimensions of space. And so part of the challenge has been trying to figure out whether there are ways to probe these other dimensions. And with string theory, there actually are some ideas on the table that could be tested. And with macroscopic extra dimensions, there are ideas on the table that couldn't test them directly, but could test signatures of them. So, it's not completely off the table as crazy. And I am of the mind, and I think this is not a popular opinion in science, but in my middle age, I'm willing to hold on popular opinions, that if we can't rule something out and we don't know what the answer is, we need to keep all the viable options on the table, and extra dimensions are still a viable option.
It's fascinating. I wanted to ask you another question before I do. I just to let everybody. I know we have some new people in with us today. What we're going to do on this, if you have a question for our author, if you'll just text that to Brady or Daniel, and they'll, you just do it several ways. You can ask to what your question is, or you can have Brady or Daniel just ask the question for you if you'd rather not come on camera and do it yourself. So I'll give you a chance to do that. And while we go to those other questions, let me ask you, Kelsey, on the you had a background also, like our other co-founder, of a background of being Christian, and you arrived at kind of in your own journey, apart from your family, apart from your mom,
Mm-hmm.
and so and in that journey, um, you seem proactively looking for religion or spirituality or maybe Jesus. I don't know how you would phrase it, but you seem to be looking at that as your way out, your way of breaking the cycle or having transcendence of some type. So tell us a little bit about the journey that became some doubts. It became questions. It became doubts. Or kind of take us on that part of the journey when you
Mm-hmm.
turn away. I know you don't identify as atheist and even agnostic. That's a nebulous kind of thing too. So you could address that as well. How you identify yourself right now.
How do I identify? What is the best way I could phrase this? Um, I I'm more than agnostic, but I wouldn't go so far as to say religious, right? I feel like there's like a fluid continuum here. And I would say that my thinking on this is fairly fluid, and I think that that's healthy because I'm always taking in ideas and concepts and philosophies from different people and integrating them in with my own. And so I don't identify as Christian in the formal sense, though I do identify with some of the tenets of the faith. Um, my own journey, geez, this will probably bore the pants off of everyone, so I don't know how much of a rabbit trail you want to go down here. Um, really at the core, and I think you may have taken this from my interview with Dan, is for me, I have since my earliest days been truly impelled to try to understand not just what it means to be human in the universe, but my own, to make this all about me, right? Because we're all, I guess, egocentric at some level. I've always been driven to try to understand why I existed and what my place in the universe was. And for most of my formative life, the only lens through which I could explore that was religion. Ultimately, the faith I don't want to say I was brought up in because it wasn't a passive thing, that I chose to bring myself up in, let me down. And I could talk about how that happened. But in many ways, it was a good training in, I guess, maybe opening your mind to possibilities, right, that are not necessarily scientifically testable. I do believe that there are things that are true that are not scientifically testable. In fact, we know that from Gödel's incompleteness theorem. We know that there are things that are true that are not testable. And I hold that as a central tenet in my own belief system. So I don't know where you want to go from that, because I feel very awkward going on a monologue about my
No,
own
no,
path.
it's not to me. It's not. Don't apologize at all because I mean, to me, part of the whole fascination with both the Christians and the atheist authors that we've had in our club is just knowing about them, their personal journey, and how that interacted with their, their education, their worldview, all that was shaped through that journey. So to me, it's fascinating. It's not something to apologize for. It helps us to understand you better.
Yeah, and Kelsey, I think when we were talking, I said one of my it was a surprise, but but a delightful surprise. And one of the best chapters in the book was your chapter early on with epistemology. How do we know what we know? I think that was refreshing to see in a book about the universe. You know, that was really good. We could launch from what you just did there into how do we know what we're talking about?
Well, I'm so glad that you like that chapter on epistemology, because that for me
Yes.
was a gamble, right? You don't I've had lots of people ask me, like, why did you put a chapter on epistemology in a book about astronomy? But for me, if we're not willing to take a step back from the outset and think about how we know what we know, or if we know anything at all, I feel like we're ill equipped to move forward in talking about what we don't know.
You were very, I think, balanced. You had some really good criticisms of positivism, and as our talk centered on was this idea of epistemic humility that what we don't know to some extent should humble us, not embolden us to be pouncing on people. And that's what I really liked about the book overall was just this idea that there's so much we don't know. We're not omniscient. Science isn't omniscient. We do know a lot of things, but let's not use our knowledge as weapons. I think that really came across well in that chapter.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, let's not use knowledge as weapons. For me, um, I've tried to take on a practice of daily, I have a whole journal I use for my work activities. Um, and a daily practice for me with all of my meetings is to before the meeting write down my intention. Because I feel like intentions are really powerful in setting our brains. And for me, an intention that is always top of mind, and I think it's important to remind myself of this because I don't think we can remind ourselves of our intentions too often, is to be in a place of, I would say, curious humility, right? I think humility is incredibly important. In fact, I was just reading, for reasons we don't need to go into, some work of Epictetus, the ancient Stoic today. And, he has this quote about, I'm going to totally muddle this, right? But if you want to make progress, you need to be willing to appear stupid and ignorant. And I think that there's real truth in that, in having real, authentic, genuine humility about the limits of what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not willing to acknowledge those limits, I don't know how we expect to make progress in our own thinking.
Yeah, I'm in another book club. I think I told you in Dallas we meet in person. It's an all atheist book club, and they've invited me a few times to come back and we're doing your book next week. But we're doing it live, but we're having a dinner together, and then we talk about the book. But I'm hosting the book. I'm walking through the chapters, and I'm leading the discussion. And they all know I'm a Christian, but I put myself into that position for one reason, about intentionality. About, okay, Dan, you're not the know-it-all. There's a lot of smart people in that group, and I like to learn and listen from them. But it's exactly what you talk about in the epistemology book. And when you get down to those meaty conversations, if you have that sense of humility between two conversant people, you can actually accomplish quite a bit instead of like yelling at each other to prove everything. You know, it's
Yeah.
it's a great I'm living your chapter, so it's really
But I also think it's important that it be coupled with curiosity.
right, right,
Um,
yeah.
I think that it's the pairing of the two that is really powerful, because it's
Hmm.
one thing to just, admit you don't know everything and be comfortable just being ignorant.
Right.
But I think it's a richer state of ignorance if you couple it with curiosity.
So what is your baseline for, I know we've already talked about it for the sake of the group, what's your baseline for your what we your basic properly basic axiom for knowing stuff? Where do you start, Kelsey?
Oh, okay. So yeah, nothing like diving into epistemology. So I tend to subscribe to, there's a basic framework in epistemology called justified true belief.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I see lots of people nodding, but in case everyone's not on board with us, I'll just give a quick primer and hopefully you won't. And Joel, by the way, thanks for finding the full Epictetus quote. So the basic framework for justified true belief is that to know something, one, it has to be true. You have to believe it to be true, which is fine. But we have to acknowledge that there are probably things we believe that aren't true, and there are probably things that are true that we don't believe. And so that's where the justification piece comes, because to know something, it has to be true. You have to believe it to be true, and it has to be justified. Now, where epistemologists really get into heated debates is what counts as justification, and how watertight does your justification need to be. And it turns out, like, if you're really a stickler for what it means for something to be justified, it is very, very hard for any explanation we have to be justified 100%, like to infinite precision, right? There might be things that are justified to 99.9%, but it's very hard to actually have a watertight definition. And so I tend to a philosophical position intellectually, if not in my lived life, but intellectually, I tend to a philosophical position called global skepticism. I'm actually not intellectually convinced that we know anything with a capital K. I think that, and practically, we have to live our practical lives and eat food and have jobs and do all those things. And we know lots of things with a lowercase k. But I am personally not convinced that any explanations we have for anything are watertight, with the possible exception of math. There are some things in math that it's very hard to imagine ways for them not to be true. But even in the book, I go through the example how in Principia Mathematica, it took over 300 pages to prove 1 + 1 = 2. And even that relied on fundamental assumptions that themselves can't be proved. So I would argue, we have to be really careful about ever arguing we know anything with a capital K. But yes, of course, we have to be practical and live our lives. I don't know what kind of life you would have if you truly believed that we didn't know anything. But there is a cognitive dissonance there that I want to acknowledge.
Yeah.
It
I
seems like
apologize for my
all of our models have shelf lives. They will be improved upon, at least improved upon, if not jettisoned.
Well, and and that's part of being human. It's certainly part of science, right? The whole point of science is to constantly be improving our understanding of the universe. And so we expect our hypotheses and our theories in science to change. But I would say even outside of science, right? Our lived experiences, as we gather more lived experience and, absorb different ways of thinking, I feel like that has to be flexible too.
Yeah, Daniel, did you have? I didn't mean to interrupt. Were you?
Oh no, I was just I know I've been having some technical issues with my mic. I sound like I'm in one of those other dimensions. I don't know what's wrong with it.
Fine to me.
It just sounds kind of robotic. But I just interviewed in January after our interview, Kelsey. I had the opportunity to talk to a particle physicist and a cosmologist together at the same table. We had a fun chat. I'll send you the interview link. It was great. And the funny thing is that Dr. Barnes, he's like a 6 foot, he's a really big guy. And Michael, the particle physicist, he's like really short. So you have the cosmologist, really tall cosmologist, and a really short particle physicist. It was funny. But I asked Michael, I said, well, he told me, I think something related to the dimensions was that we need a particle accelerator with greater energy capacity.
Mhm.
And we were joking about a particle accelerator going around the equator, and could you get it 11 dimensions with that? And apparently, you need something much more than planet size if you want to get into the energy needed to get into the fields. Does that sound right? That we can't probe we don't have enough energy in a collider to probe those dimensions where they may exist, right?
Yes and no. There's a little bit of a subtlety here, which is actually kind of cool. And I don't know if any of you will remember, gosh, when was this? It must have been at least 10, maybe 15 years ago when the Large Hadron Collider came online underneath Switzerland. I'm trying to remember when that was. Maybe one of you can quickly Google it. And it was a really big deal that this was coming online, the most energetic collider ever on the planet. And there was an absolute outrage, and it resulted actually in at least one person committing suicide. So this was not without harm. There was a speculation that the Large Hadron Collider could create a micro black hole. Yes, you got it, Joel. And the reality is that it could, in fact, create a micro black hole if, and only if, there are compactified extra dimensions. And those compactified extra dimensions, insofar as we understand how they might operate, would serve to focus the energy in a way that would enable that micro black hole to form.
Gotcha.
We have not, well, trust me or not, right? We have not created a micro black hole to date in the Large Hadron Collider. And it may
Except
be
financially, right? Except financially.
Well, okay, that's okay. That's Europe's problem. But it's quite right that as we're able to probe higher and higher energies, we're able to probe smaller and smaller size scales, and we could eventually get to the energetics of being able to probe these compactified dimensions. But it's still on the table, right? It's still on the Large Hadron Collider could still potentially create a micro black hole if conditions are right and particles collide exactly the right way with the right energetics. It just hasn't happened yet. And by the way, I feel like I have to say as like a caveat to all of this, even if it did, you don't need to worry. And this is what caused the suicide, or at least one suicide, because, well, for one thing, if the LHC the Large Hadron Collider is able to do this, nature would be doing it all the time anyway. And we can predict what would happen, and all of it would be fine. The black hole would evaporate, and the worst possible case scenario is that if it created a micro black hole and it didn't evaporate, what it would do is fall to the center of the Earth, where it would sort of oscillate around the core, slowly accumulating mass, and it would take like thousands of years for it to accumulate as much mass as like a car. So anyway, you don't need to worry about that. But all of that is to say that probing these size scales is on the horizon.
So LHC around the equator then, huh? We're going for it?
I'm sure that there's an international treaty underway right now.
That'd be great.
So we're safe in that no human has been killed by a black hole yet, right?
Well, not that we know of.
That's right. Well, they're safer. Statistically, they are safer than this planet because nobody has died that we know of from a black hole yet. So, but
speaking of,
go ahead, Brady.
Well, I was going to say, speaking of knowing, Phil has a question, but if you want to finish your thought, then we can turn it back over.
Oh, no, I was going to introduce Phil's question.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. You're up, Phil.
Well, I just, this might seem to be a little bit of a fine detail, but don't think I'm necessarily clear on the difference between knowledge with a capital K and knowledge with a small k. I think I know I know what you're getting at, but I'm not sure I do. So I don't want to just assume that I understand without clarifying it. And, because I want to take the position of the ignorant, because that's the best and safest path to take. So
I love that, Phil. That was super meta in terms of what we're talking about. So I could just say how I define knowledge with a capital K and a lowercase k, and maybe there isn't a strict divide. For me, knowledge with a capital K would be something that we know 100% with no possible doubt to be true.
So is it certainty? Is certainty the key word?
But absolute certainty beyond what we would normally. The problem with words, there are many problems with words. The problem with words is that we have words like certain that carry different weights for different people and mean different things. And I think when most people say certain, they mean like really statistically likely, like really, really statistically likely. Whereas in this case, I really mean like bedrock certain, like certain with a capital C. And that's where I am not convinced, and I'm willing to try to be convinced. And believe me, my students try to convince me, and we have a lot of fun in class on this. I am not convinced that I've never encountered a case where there isn't some way we could be deceiving ourselves, or something that could make our arguments watertight. So yeah, so for me, knowledge with a capital K is like that bedrock certainty. Whereas knowledge with a lowercase k is, it's practical knowledge, things that we really believe to be true for all intents and purposes. Like, I believe my name to be Kelsey. It's on my birth certificate. My mom called me that, right? I believe that I am wearing gray pants. I can see them with my eyes. Like, there are things we believe to be true. And I'm comfortable calling those knowledge with a lowercase k, because most people would think you were insane if you didn't. But acknowledging that there could be ways we are leading ourselves astray.
Most people think I'm insane anyway. So, so I
makes
wonder,
it fun to talk to then.
Yeah, I don't know that I really want to belabor the point too much, but I was thinking about offering a proposal about how we could differentiate between the two, because in my studies of epistemology at the University of Iowa, University of Colorado, and all my own crazy study that, who knows what I might come up with, but it seems to me that we could propose that if something has rational justification, a priori rational justification to it, and that it is the conclusion of a sound deductive argument, that we could call that knowledge with 100% reliability, or knowledge with certainty. And that if we want to talk about a posteriori knowledge, and knowledge that is arrived at through empirical evidence and so on, then we could say that is not 100% reliable, but it has such high probability of being true that we can rely on it in our daily lives. And if that's the case, it's okay that since it was arrived at through inductive reasoning, it's okay that we don't have absolute 100% reliability and certainty with that, because it's so highly probable that it would be impractical for us to live our lives as though it wasn't true. So I was just going to see what you thought of that, because the epistemology is what really was. Philosophy interests me more than science does, only by a little bit, and so I wish I had been able to get your book and read it before the session tonight, but my antennas went up when we started talking about epistemology, and I like it when scientists are sensitive to the issue of epistemology. And I think that sometimes scientists can be a little bit relaxed, maybe too relaxed on the issue of epistemology. And I don't think that serves their discipline well, to be real honest with you. And so I always encourage scientists to be well read on epistemology and to be sensitive to that issue, because I think it makes them better scientists. That's my humble, ignorant opinion.
Oh my gosh, Phil, you and I, we are kindred spirits here. And I am a scientist, and I feel the same way about scientists. So for what it's worth, and I too love thinking about epistemology. I think the proposal you put on the table makes a lot of sense, and I think there is a lot of, as you said, we have to be practical, and it's there's a lot of things we believe to be true by induction, and that's fine. We have to go through our lives in a way that makes sense. When it comes to actual like rational deductive proofs, usually where the rubber hits the road for me are on, can you prove the axioms that feed into that logical proof? Can you prove those axioms to be true? And the answer is almost, as far as I'm concerned, always no. And that's the whole thing with axioms, right? Is you can't, they're not intended themselves to be proven as true. They're taken as devices to start the logical argument. And this is where I'll come back to math again, right? To my mind, the closest we can come to saying that we believe our axioms to be true is in math, but even that I think is open to question and debate.
Well, I just want to say one more thing. I appreciate that. That is profound and refreshing. And I want to say one more thing, and maybe just as a comment, and then I'll shut up and stop dominating. I don't want to dominate the book club, but in my humble opinion, I think the most effective path to what we can hope for as certainty or absolute knowledge, whatever terminology you want to use, is that I think the most effective path is the principle of self-referential incoherence.
Mm-hmm.
So if a proposition has self-referential incoherence and actually implies its own contradiction, necessarily implies its own contradiction, then we can pretty much know with a capital K, I think, that proposition is false. And if we know that a self-contradictory or self-referentially incoherent proposition is false, we also know something else, and that is that we know that its contradiction is true. So that can be an extremely powerful path to knowledge, and I think that's probably, in my view, I think that's one of the most effective paths to knowledge. And one of the examples that I like to use, my favorite example, is the proposition knowledge is impossible. Because if knowledge is impossible, it would be impossible to know that knowledge is impossible. Therefore, it is self-referentially incoherent. It implies its own contradiction, and therefore its contradiction must be true, which means knowledge is possible.
Yeah, but now you're getting into some deep Descartes for sure. So please do read my book, because I have a whole bunch in the chapter on the laws of the universe that has to do with self-reference and contradictions.
Absolutely, I will. I'm looking forward to it. And I apologize for not having read it before the clubs.
You should apologize, but you can make up for it by reading it later. One of the, I'll say this on this thread, and then we can pivot, because I imagine people will get bored if we're just debating epistemology for an hour. One of the thinkers that I'm really taken with is Alfred Tarski. I don't know if you're familiar with Tarski. He was both a sort of a symbolic linguist and a mathematician, right, which is really symbolic language. And his position, which I have been persuaded by, is that he argues it for linguistic systems. I like to deploy it more broadly than that, thinking about, for example, the universe. But his argument is that within a closed linguistic system, it cannot define its own truth and false predicates. And the only way to define truth and false predicates is to get into a meta system outside of it. Anyway, it's very deep, but would love to nerd out with you on the philosophy there, because there's a lot that has to do with self-referential paradoxes and what that means for us in terms of what we know. So you and we're very kindred spirits, Phil.
Well, I would love to have you on my podcast. I would love to have you as a guest. That would be fun. And I'll make a deal with you. I'll read your book if you read my book, Machines Don't Laugh.
Ooh, I will. That sounds great.
Deal.
I'm writing it down.
And you can get it on Amazon, but if you would like a free copy, I'm happy to send one to you.
I will get it on Amazon, because it is always good to get the rankings up and the reviews up. I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Thank you, and I'll yield the floor. That was delightful. Thank you.
Hey, Daniel, do we have somebody else in the queue?
I mean, I don't get to nerd out on epistemology very often, so I just have to say this is delightful for me.
We do not have any.
I had a follow-up if nobody else will step in.
And Bill did get in, so whenever you're ready to
talk. I saw Bill, but I didn't see if that was our bill or not. So Bill,
it is our bill.
Okay, great. Well, I have a pre-question for you here. you dealt with all the controversial stuff in your book. I was just go over the chapters again. So Kelsey, was there what have you gotten the most pushback? And maybe I don't know if you've gotten from your peers or not, but like I'm thinking from the general public. Have you gotten pushback on in any of your chapters more than the others?
Mm. I really, I almost wish that I had gotten more pushback, in a way, because that would mean people were really absorbing it and thinking about it and pushing back on it. Maybe not. Maybe, it's a really weird thing to, and it's a really, really weird thing to have a book out there and have people thinking about it. I think that the thing that is most engaging to the lay public are the earlier chapters on the Big Bang and extraterrestrial life, because I think those are things that okay, I'm saying something I have no data to back up, but my perception is that most normal adult humans have at some point thought about the existence of extraterrestrial life or where the universe came from. They're like the two.
That's back in the news right now. I mean, that's the hot, in the last couple of months, that's been the hot thing again. It keeps perpetually coming back around and around. So you've gotten some on that. Now for our book club, the chapter 10 on the fine tuning, the little history on us. Bill, he's in the room with us now, but Bill, our other co-founder, who's our atheist component, he has for about a year now been having his own existential crisis of faith or lack of faith. I don't know how you would define that, but anyway, a lot of it around the fine tuning argument. And he's had a long, an hour-long private Zoom with in Australia with Luke Barnes, who was one of the Christian cosmologists that Daniel was talking about, just on his book on fine tuning, which was co-authored by an atheist, actually. And so they agree on all the science of it. The implications of it, they have a different perspective with each other. But that's going to be the thing that probably Bill is going to want to talk to you about a little bit on that. So could you just recap for us the possibility or probabilities of some type of fine tuning, or at least the appearance of fine tuning?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'm trying to gauge is I don't want to be pedantic, and so I would like a sense of what people already know, and where I can start the conversation. So if this is too high or too dumbed down,
we know about dark matter and dark energy, which are invisible, and it is fascinating that is it 85% of the universe or 95%? 95. Isn't that amazing?
It is mind-blowing, and I wish more people knew that we fundamentally have no idea what 95% of the universe is.
Now, I know Phil likes to talk philosophy, but I just go with what the Bible says. So if you guys want to turn to Romans 1:18, I'll get to that in a minute. But Dr. Kelsey, I asked God to reveal himself to me in a more personal way. And you know what he said? He does not reveal himself to YouTubers with subscribers of under 10,000. So I'm going to say a lot. I didn't have enough subscribers. So maybe Kelly with Godless Granny has 11,000. Maybe he'll reveal himself to her, but I just don't have enough subscribers.
Why don't you to put that she's right. We need a context on this. Bill, could you take a couple of minutes and say what about the fine tuning argument has caused you to scratch your head about this as an atheist? And then maybe she can pick it up from there. And
it's nice to have someone that actually knows what they're talking about, because one of my questions is, okay, 380,000 years after the Big Bang, you have atoms formed, correct, Dr. Kelsey? Mm-hmm. When does electromagnetism form? Because you have to have the protons and neutrons capture the electrons, so therefore you have to have electromagnetism. Oh, I got it out.
You got it out. We believe that electromagnetism as a force has been around since very, very, very early times, like much, much, much earlier than that. The force has been there. Mm-hmm. I have a plot. Did I put the plot? I took so many figures out of my book because it was getting too long. But
is that before the strong nuclear force?
So what we think happened was early, like early in the universe, like very, like right when it was, I don't want to say it came into existence because that presumes it came into existence, but even before the Big Bang. And actually, let me decouple this. I want to take this as a quick sidebar. There's a very common misconception, I think, in the general public that the Big Bang is equal to the creation of the universe. And I want to say that that is not true. And just be clear about this. So the Big Bang, when scientists refer to it and what it was named for, was what we infer to be this incredibly, insanely rapid expansion, inflation of the universe at a very, very, very early time. So it went from some tiny little nugget of whatever it was and inflated by literally astronomical timescales very quickly. And that's what we call the Big Bang.
Kelsey, just really quickly, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you
Yeah.
hit on something that I think if you may be about to clarify this, but did that, I don't think, did inflation, what you just described, did that exist in the Fred Hoyle era when from
No.
to Fred Hoyle? No, so this was Alan Guth, right? So now
yeah, it was sort of an army of scientists that brought it on the table, but yeah.
So the Big Bang was something before Alan Guth's theory of inflation, right? Big Bang was for a time, wasn't it, creation for a time to some extent?
Yeah, and that's actually why Fred Hoyle got us all into trouble and coined it.
Yeah.
Because Fred Hoyle,
Right.
you may know, was a staunch atheist.
Right.
And didn't want there to have been a beginning to the universe because that could suggest there was a creator. And I think this is a terrible example of all the kinds of biases misleading our thinking. And that led to coining the term Big Bang in jest, which has led generations of people now astray in terms of thinking about what it actually is that we think happened.
But you still have inflation where you have the universe doubling, what is it, 80 times and expanding 100,000 light years in a brief second. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, in less than a second.
Oh, my. So how does that happen?
Well, that is one of the great unsolved mysteries in the universe. But Bill, I'm bringing this back to your question about forces, though. I promise I'm looping back. We're covering a lot of ground, like with the universe right now. But one of the ideas on the table, we suspect, I don't want to go so far as to say believe, but one of the more believed hypotheses on the table right now is that in the very, very early universe, the four forces as we know them now were actually a single force. And that as the universe expanded and cooled down, those forces started to fracture off. The analogy I use with my students, because this is something that I think it gets very theoretical and very abstract very quickly. So with my students, I use the analogy of ice, because most people have made ice at some point in their lives. And if you can imagine putting like a little bin or ice cube tray in your freezer that has water in it, at the beginning, when you first put it in, that water appears to be totally uniform, right? It's just water. But as it freezes, I mean, unless you are especially good at making ice cubes in a way that I am not, you're going to get fractures in that ice, right? That appear to be sort of random. And I think the way I intuit the very, very, very early universe was as it cooled down from that state, it actually sort of fractured. And in this, not literally fractured in a spatial way, but the forces sort of split off from each other. And gravity, we think, split off first. And gravity is an odd duck all the way around. We could spend a whole hour talking about gravity, but I don't know that anyone wants to do that unless you want to have me back. The weak force and the electromagnetic force and the strong force stayed together for a little while. And then they broke apart, and then we had the weak force and the electromagnetic force stayed together, and then they broke apart. But we think, or at least let me backpedal a little bit. One conjecture that's on the table is that what actually drove this inflation of the universe was that fracturing of the universe, and that injected, think of it, I don't know if you all are in the South. I grew up in Minnesota, and I had the great pleasure of being in Minnesota in the winter, which I actually love because I'm a freak. But if you can imagine, if you've ever had this experience of standing on a frozen lake and that ice fractures, if it cracks, that sound it just reverberates and sends energy through that whole sheet. And so that for me is my visualization of how the forces split off. But that's what triggered inflation. And I think that gets back to what you were asking.
But what's the chances? Okay, it seems positive, negative, the electromagnetic force. You could see that maybe evolving by chance, correct?
I don't know if I would say chance, but keep going. Let me see where you're
Okay.
going with this.
So, but then comes the strong nuclear force. What's the chance that these protons and neutrons, where protons and neutrons, which would repel each other, are now held together by this really interesting, strong? What's the possibility that these things came about by chance?
Okay, so now we're getting to the core of fine tuning. So, and it's not just these things, right? There are all of these other components of the universe that have very specific values. And just to, state, I think what is obvious in this Zoom room, if their values, there are 20 or so things in the universe, depends on what exactly you count, that we think are fundamental, meaning they're not dependent on other things that we know of. We think, at least today, that they're fundamental, and they have very precise values, sometimes known to a large number of significant digits. And we don't know why they have the values that they do, which sort of pisses us off as physicists, because we like to know why. But more than that, and Bill, this is to your point, right? If their values had been different, sometimes by only tiny, like minuscule amounts, life as we know it, and I want to stress that as we know it, would be very unlikely to come about in our universe. And so that's really the foundation of the fine tuning issue. Now, there are a lot of different ways one can approach this. And one thing I want to invite us to be mindful of are really three-ish sort of philosophical positions. One is, I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with the God of the gaps fallacy. So I want to just, that is always top of mind for me. Let's not, with our limited human brains, which are only 1.2% different than that of chimpanzees, let's not assume that we are capable of understanding everything, because I think that's hubris, and I think hubris is folly. So one, let's just be mindful of our own intellectual limitations. But two, the other thing which I think gets less attention is what's called, and apologies again if you all talk about this all the time, so I don't mean to be pedantic, I really don't, but it's what's called availability error. And that is a fallacy that leads you to jump to conclusions that are available to you. So in other words, you're not likely to think of a solution that you're not likely to think of. And so for most people, for me, this comes to play with fine tuning, because for most people, when we think about fine tuning and you talk to the average person on the street and you explain fine tuning to them and ask them what the options are really going to be two things. It will be either there's a higher power or it was chance. And depending on your philosophical or religious position, one of those is not likely to feel very comfortable. So the issue is, though, there are actually a number of other possibilities that we know of, and there are probably even additional possibilities we don't know of that could explain fine tuning. And so I want to, I guess, encourage us to not fall into sort of a false dichotomy, thinking that it was either chance or it was a higher power, because there are other options on the table. And I'd love to talk about.
What about
That's
necessity?
been brought up before in our book club is, in biology, you have Darwinism as being this new idea that could possibly explain the without a creator, how you get from point A to point B. If you could forget the abiogenesis issue, but just talk about the evolution of life. Well, here's a way that doesn't require, but nobody had thought of that at the time as a possible solution until roughly the time of Darwin. So there may be something like that you're saying when it comes to the fine-tuning parameters in the Big Bang and elsewhere that we just haven't thought of yet.
But here's the thing, James, is so many things have to be just right, like the mass of the electron, the spin of the electron, the charge of light. How does that, and plus the relationship, the proton is just vastly more massive than the electron. How does that happen, Dr. Kelsey?
Okay, I can't give you the how because I don't know the answer to that. But what I do want to offer you are some other options to consider. And I will say I'm actually fairly agnostic about which of the possibilities on the table are true, because I don't know. I have some that I want to be true, but that is a terrible reason to believe something. So could be a higher power, right? That's clearly on the table for many people. One option I want to offer you with respect to a higher power, I think when many people think of a higher power, they think of sort of a conventional God-like deity. That need not be true. It could be some sort of, and I don't know how you would distinguish between the two, but not a conventional God, but more like a super intelligent extraterrestrial being or civilization that created our universe as simulation, a model, a toy, right? That's actually an option on the table. It's still a higher power. It's just not the traditional Judeo-Christian higher power, right? It's a different kind of higher power. But there are other options on the table too. So for example, one that I'm quite fond of is that maybe there are an infinite number of universes, or if not an infinite, maybe a very, very large number, in which case, and there are actual reasons. There's a chapter on it in my book. There are actual reasons to think there might be other universes, like real legitimate reasons, not just science fiction reasons. And if there are a very large number, possibly infinite number of other universes, one of them is going to have the conditions that we have. And of course, we're going to find ourselves in the ones that we find ourselves in, because it allows for us to exist. There are other options too. One I'm very mindful of. I think of as sort of chauvinism, in the sense that we tend to think of life that we think of, and I really always want to stress life as we know it, because I think, what do I know? Take any set of conditions in a universe, and perhaps life of some kind would evolve. It wouldn't, I don't know if we would even recognize it as life from our provincial human perspective, but I think we have to acknowledge that, yes, even today, biologists have a terrible job trying to define life. We can't define life. But what if life can take radically different forms, and potentially, right, any universe with any set of physical conditions could have some kind of life, whether or not we would recognize it as being similar to life as we know it. And as far as we know, that life would be thinking to itself, wow, how lucky are we to be in this universe that has exactly the physical conditions that we need to exist? And we can't fathom other life. So in all of this, could it be a higher power? For sure. I can't rule that out. I think that's totally on the table. Whether it's a conventional God or a super intelligent alien species, I have no idea. But there are also other options on the table that I think we would be remiss to to dismiss and not consider in our thinking.
Well, here's
on that one, if I could, Bill, let me ask just a clarification on that. So I've heard other people make similar possibilities. We think of carbon-based life, and we think that's the only life there could be, but there could be silicon-based life. Maybe there could be all kinds of possibilities. But part of the problem to me in it, unless
you've been watching Star Trek.
This may be a caricature of what the issue or the problem is, but one of those finely tuned parameters, or apparently finely tuned, is the expansion rate. And the way that I understand it's been explained to me is if the expansion rate had been minutely greater or less, either one, you don't only not get stars, you don't get planets, you don't get the periodic table, you get hydrogen and maybe helium. Is that right? And I just can't imagine any kind of life. And maybe I don't have a good enough imagination, but if you leave hydrogen and helium alone long enough, it forms some type of sentient life. I don't see that.
I'm with you, James, and I don't necessarily see it either. But this is where I immediately fall back to saying, just because I don't see something doesn't mean that's not possible.
But here's the thing, Dr. Kelsey, and this is actually James' favorite verse in the Bible. Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived. So the Bible is saying these things like dark matter, dark energy, the quarks, the electrons, these things we can't see, the invisible things, show the attributes and glory of God. Do you agree with that?
Wow. Okay. Do I agree with that?
And are you suppressing the truth?
No, I'm a fan of seeking the truth. I'm also, you know, I'm persuaded by, I would need to think about that scripture a little bit longer to give you a really thoughtful answer, but I will say that I'm persuaded by the anti-Nazi theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I think some of you are familiar with, and he the way he says this, and I'm going to get this quote wrong, so maybe Joel will come to my rescue again, is we should find God in what we know and not in what we don't know. And to me, that has some value. And Bill, I think that might be a little bit aligned with what you're saying. You know, if I were to reflect this back into my own, I guess I would call it spirituality, I do find existence that we have in the universe to be unbelievably beautiful and glorious. I mean, I infer that many of you have not read the book, which is fine, but please do. I'm not kidding when I say, you know, I'm out walking in the woods every day, and, you know, I will stop for, you know, minutes or even hours at a time sometime to inspect moss or mushrooms or fractal structures or the bark on a tree or a raindrop hanging from a branch. Like, there's so much exquisite beauty around us that, to me, it's not just that it's aesthetically beautiful, which I would argue it is, but it has all these other elements of beauty built into it that, to me, have actually kind of become a spiritual practice. And so for me, I find spirituality often, it's a combination of the things that we know and the things that we don't know.
So you don't identify as an atheist. What's interesting is it seems you're kind of living with the tension, which is like my gospel. So you agree with that. All right.
Oh, I totally live with the tension.
Okay, that's my gospel. But see, Christians cannot live with the tension. They want you to make a decision. They want certainty, and that leads them to 6,000 year universes and big arcs in Kentucky, $100 million waste. So, you know, the other question, you know, Daniel brought out the fine structure constant, which 1/137. If it's not right, if it's 4% off, we don't get carbon in stars. So the great Friedman said, every physicist should put this on the board and worry about it. Are you worried?
I think I have other things to worry about.
We have a video about the fine structure constant, Kelsey, if you want to. It's like 2 minutes if you want to see it.
I mean, I think the fine structure constant is one of these very interesting constants. To be clear, it actually depends. The fine structure constant depends on some other physical parameters, which themselves have values that we don't understand.
Like constant and speed of light. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. But it all comes back to, and this is, you know, if I put my scientist hat back on, we don't know why they have the values that they do. And this is very much an outstanding question. It's also one of the questions that string theory is posed to answer if we can get that far.
But the bottom line is there should be enough evidence with the gravitational constant fine-tuned to 10 to the 40th, the cosmological constant, 10 to the 120th. Even Sean Carroll says this is just amazing. Isn't there, like what Romans says, isn't there enough evidence to go and make that commitment to theism?
I don't think so. I think it is. I think it's an option on the table, but okay. I think there are other options on the table that are as equally valid or invalid, depending on your perspective, that are as equally testable or untestable. I also don't think that one's commitment to theism should be vested in fine tuning. I think this comes back to the Bonhoeffer quote, right? I think it's very likely that physics of the future, whether it's in 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years, will come to understand why we have the values of the universe that we do. And, you know, if your commitment to theism comes from believing in fine tuning from a higher power, then poof, there goes your belief. So I think that's a terrible thing for one to base one's faith on. I also,
what's so
go ahead.
terrible is 40% of the population believe the universe is 6,000 years old. And these answers in Genesis and these ministries right here in Dallas, we have Institute for Creation Research, have infiltrated these churches, and they have a huge impact. So hopefully people like you can, educate them and lead them to, believe in things which are so absurd. And it's just like education with, especially if these homeschools with this, creation propaganda. And you mentioned you had a PhD student who was just learning this stuff just so he could validate the Bible. So don't you think that someone needs to address that and educate these Christians?
I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying. I truly do. And you may be curious too. I didn't name check him in the book. The student I went to graduate school with, you may know, as Jason Lyle.
Oh, I was going to mention him. He's the one who goes real fast one way and slows down the other way.
Yeah. So I have some really, I've had a lot of really interesting interactions with Jason over the years. And as a grad student, he was clear about his ideas and his positionality. And he's a very articulate person. I will say he's rhetorically sort of a brilliant person, which is annoying as heck for me, but is also true. But his position, and I can't say that this is wrong, is that it depends on your fundamental axioms. And if your fundamental axioms are that a higher power created the universe less than 10,000 years ago in a way to mimic a universe that looks 14 billion years old, I can't disprove that. Now it's entirely at odds with empirical inquiry, but then this comes back to the need for scientists to have humility about the limits of empirical inquiry. And so I happen to think, and I'm saying more, this is being recorded, so I'm going to get please, maybe I shouldn't say anymore. I happen to think that a lot of what Jason says and what he writes about, he knows to be false. I've heard him lie overtly in several interviews, especially about his graduate school experience, which makes my blood boil. I think he gets away with it because he's rhetorically brilliant. He must, at some level, know that he's being a scam artist and a con man, because he must know that he's lying, because I know that he's lying. And he must know that he is not conveying the science correctly. I mean, he must know these things, and yet he does it. And so that is what really bothers me. And so if people want to argue with that you have a fundamental axiom that we cannot prove or disprove, I'm not going to argue with that, because we can't prove or disprove it. But when you are duplicitous in your arguments for it, and you try to convince people through dishonest measures, that's when my blood pressure just goes through the roof.
And it's just the tired light, appearance of age, all these ridiculous things. Supernova 1987. We saw it in 1987. By simple logic, it took 156,000 years to get here. So we saw this live on the telescopes. That should be enough to negate. But their middle name is confirmation bias, Christians. So especially young earthers. And you cannot get through to them. And Eric Coven's a friend of mine, and I like it, but he just is not going to budge.
I see, John, I see your hands up, and we will
sorry.
get to you in just a second. But first, I think we have a question or comment from Ken. Ken, you want to unmute and talk with us?
Hey, this is a real treat to have this discussion. I appreciate you coming on board. My background is I grew up as a Christian. I was a missionary in Africa, and over a period of time, reading the Bible, especially the Old Testament, kind of set me off on a period of doubt, and I ended up being more of an atheist than an agnostic, but sometimes I swing back towards agnosticism and sometimes even towards theism.
You're fluid like me.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the the esoteric discussions are great. Sometimes I'm interested in like personal convictions or personal reasons for things that people have. And so my question to you was going to be, and I have it written up here somewhere, so I'm scrolling back up. Do you think it's more likely than not that a supernatural realm exists? and why or why not? And if there is a supernatural realm, does it include a personal deity who has an interest in us, or who can in any way interact with us? So that's
oh my gosh, that's like a whole college essay question right there. It's actually really funny. My middle child is a first year at William and Mary this year, and he just took a course in the fall called The Philosophy of God, in which they got deep into the philosophical arguments here that you're hinting at in your question. And I don't want to re-articulate or adjudicate those right now, but what I will say I am convinced of. I am convinced as I can be, that our own human intellectual capacity is limited, and that there are things that we don't understand, and as far as I can tell, we will never understand. And we hit this with, someone mentioned turtles all the way down earlier in the chat, right? There are things that there are philosophical knots that we hit that, at least to me and my brain in the modern age, appear to be impossible to disentangle, and infinite regression is one of these. And what in my mind is purely logical means, I have come to conclude that there are things that our brains cannot comprehend now, at least, and possibly ever. Although I want to say that lightly, because I don't want to be the cynical baked in old person who says things are impossible and then they turn out to be true. I never want to be that person, and I always want to hold open just a little sliver of possibility. But I believe there to be things that are true about the universe that we can't understand and possibly can't ever understand. And does that include room for some kind of a higher power? Absolutely. Am I committed to the idea of there being a higher power? That's where I start to waffle. I think there's something we don't understand. I don't know that I'm committed to it being an entity per se. I also just think that actually kind of kicks the can down the road in terms of infinite regression. Because even if we think about where the universe came from, and let's say for the sake of argument in this conversation that the universe came from a higher power, that doesn't get us to where the higher power came from. And that's where we get into the deep theological arguments that, Aquinas talked about, Augustine talked about, and they used actually as proof of God. But to me, it kicks the can down the road. But I find now I'm just repeating myself over and over again and saying the same thing. So yes, I believe there are things we don't understand. I believe there is room for a higher power in that. I am not entirely convinced that there is a higher power, but I hold open space for that being true. That being said, I am fairly agnostic about whether that would be a higher power who seeks a personal relationship. I think, to me, when I start to think about the philosophical discussions around that, it just smacks of sort of human arrogance and thinking, of course, the higher power would want to have a relationship with us. And because we're so special and we're the center of the universe. And that's where I start to get a little bit uneasy philosophically, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. And I have this sort of, it's almost an anti-confirmation bias that I've trained in myself, that whenever something either feels like I want it to be true, then I want to pull back and say, okay, if you want this to be true, you have to be extra skeptical. Or there are things that if they feel uncomfortable to me, I don't want them to be true, then I want to take a step back and say, okay, but wait a second, why are you uncomfortable? And are there ways that this could be true that you're not comfortable with? And so I've gone down a whole rabbit trail now, but that's how I end up living in this space of tension, is trying to balance these things.
No, that's really good. I was a deist for a while, and I've heard some people argue that, well, what's the use of believing in a God if he's not going to, if it doesn't make any difference in our lives? So, I mean,
why does it have to have a use?
Yeah,
there's whole human bias that things.
Yeah.
Humans are all about, there has to be, exactly. And this actually drives me crazy about curiosity. One of the things, actually, this goes back to a question that James, I think you asked me earlier about what in the book has gotten pushback. A meta thing that has gotten pushback with the book is why ask? Why be curious about questions that might not have answers? And to me, that it's so intuitively obvious, and I don't understand how it's not obvious to everyone else, but it's curiosity for curiosity's sake. Why does curiosity have to have an end to it? Why does it have to be for a purpose? Why can't we be curious to be curious? Which I think is a beautiful state to be in. It's almost like in our modern Western mindset, we've become so driven by utilitarianism and the need for, the only reason to do anything is to make a product or make money. Let's just let ourselves be curious.
Amen.
Yeah, curiosity, doubt, all these things are virtues that we should embrace. I think was that it?
Yeah, no, that was good.
Ken, was that pretty much it?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. John, thanks for your hand's been up for a long time. Your arm's probably tired, but go ahead.
John, question mark. Is it really John?
We don't know. All night. First, I just want to say thank you, Doctor, for coming. A friend sent me the Freedom from Religion video that you did with someone. Then I watched you with Daniel, and then I watched you with Michael Shermer.
Oh my gosh, you've done the rounds.
I live out here in Sierra Madre between JPL, Hugh Ross, and Caltech. So I've kind of grown hearing a lot of stuff, but I'm an artist. I'm not a scientist. And I drive people crazy asking questions. I love the way that you interact with people, straw manning and steel manning, risking going to the other side and postulating, listening. Intellectual humility is a commodity that needs investment. You've said so many things in the videos that you did. Your interaction with Daniel was great. Interaction with Shermer was just as telling how you go both sides. You said something tonight I wanted to ask. As much as I enjoy, appreciate, and respect your knowledge to do both, I'm wondering how you view and define spirituality. That would be one. You said another thing about choose to trust, which I thought was fascinating. You choose to trust. But I guess what I'm going to probably come down to is I think it was in the religion one, Freedom from Religion, someone asked you defining science, and you said hypotheses that you can add empirical knowledge to have better and better hypotheses or something like that. I guess my question would come down to just this, and I'll try to make a long story short as it needs to be. How much to keep away from the dogs chasing the rabbit forever and eternal regress, how much knowledge is sufficient that when you come to a fork in the road, you take it? That it is either God or not God, how much would be sufficient?
Oh, I need to think about that. That is a hard one because I think for me, so I'm going to share something here that I don't know that I have shared in any other interviews, because this sort of is getting deep into my own way that I think about spirituality. And
fair enough.
And I now, as of this year, I now have I'm now also faculty in the religious studies department at UVA, and I've been working with folks over there and sort of living this dual life, which is I think actually richly rewarding.
And you're probably good at it.
I don't know about that. And also, by the way, John, you must be terribly sick of hearing me talk at this point after listening to all those other interviews.
No, seriously, I could go for this for hours, but I don't have enough money.
Okay, well, there's an audiobook, so you can listen to me talk through the whole audiobook that I narrate.
All right.
What's really interesting for me, and this gets to a bit of a philosophical discussion, depending on the type of religion you're coming from, right? So I brought myself up in a version of Protestantism, which has a different.
I'm a Christian. I don't know if I said that, so
okay,
maybe I did or didn't.
You know what? It shouldn't even matter for this conversation what you are.
Right.
But I think, for example, Catholicism and Protestantism have different takes on this, as do any of the other belief systems. I wish that I could convince myself to believe something. Like, I wish I could convince myself to believe in a personal God. And believe me, I have tried, but I find that I am not able to do that. I'm not able to choose to believe something. And so for your question for me, John, is really interesting, because if you
Wait, I didn't say choose to believe. It was choose to trust.
Right. Choose to trust, but to take that fork in the road.
Yes.
And for me, it's not an active choice about where I land intellectually. And so in some sense, I guess you could say that I'm just trying to compile as much thinking and philosophical inquiry and curiosity around the whole sphere of the concept to enable me to take a fork, or to take the fork one way or the other. And believe me, if I reached a point that I thought I could, I would. And so I don't know what that is, because I haven't.
That's why I so appreciated the way you say it. You like take a knife, and the Sorites paradox, it's, it, I'm sure you know it. And if I'm thinking of balancing a knife going either way, at some point it's going the other way versus the other way. And there's a change. And all the arguments I hear, which are so good, keeping away from eternal regress, what if that no matter how much science we learn, like you said about DNA, we'll never have the capacity with that 1% difference, that our brain is able to handle dimensional life that's different than what we now know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know how to respond to that, but I'm with you. Like, I an analogy I use in my book is, so I have now too many living creatures in my house. I have 2 very large dogs, and now 4 cats, thanks to a daughter who makes very compelling arguments about getting animals. I try often to think about, I know this sounds like it's a tangent, but I'll loop it back. I try to think a lot about how the universe appears to beings who are not me, whether that is other people, or in this case, my animals. And so, often when I'm out in the woods with my dogs in the mornings, I think about, what is it that they are sensing? What are they perceiving? Lord knows what they're smelling. I will tell you, like, that's a whole thing. But
how long do I have to train this lady? Yeah.
But what that brings me down to is, do our dogs, do they think about higher powers? Like, what do they think? By the way, I do think if humans have souls, animals have souls. I think I'm very much into, like, if there's a spider in my house, I will catch it and safely release it outside. I'm very pro, don't be mean to living creatures. So I think about, like, what do our animals think about, like, metaphysics? Do they think about it? Do they wonder where things came from? And do they clearly I could never teach my dogs calculus or thermodynamics or quantum mechanics. But I think it's not, one of the things I always remind myself as maybe an act of trying to restore humility is, how do we know we're not so very different from my dogs, or from your dogs or your cats, or whatever they might be, in terms of our thinking about the universe and our capacity for understanding. And for me, I find that I have to hold that central. I have to hold central that we are not that much more evolved than my dogs, who I happen to think are very smart. And I don't know that they have the capacity for religious belief. I actually have no idea. I don't even know if people are, or calculus, right? Yeah. And so by extrapolation, I just want to be mindful, always mindful of not jumping to conclusions based on my own very limited intellectual capacity.
Well, I appreciated you so much, and you were a real surprise. I'm kind of looking into NDEs, near-death experience, and I'm trying to figure out, well, what's near-life experience? So you got me thinking, and I really appreciate you. So thank you.
I appreciate you, John.
By the way,
and
Dr.
I hope,
but go ahead.
I just want to say, John, I hope you all have been around JPL and Caltech. I hope that you're doing okay.
Oh yeah, I have friends that I've been in the homes that I've seen totally demolished. I'm helping them. I there's so many, but thank you.
We have many astronomers and friends in the area who are
with JPL and Caltech. Yeah,
yeah.
It's been bad, real bad.
By the way, Dr. Kelsey, one of the Christian apologist arguments is that you have a mind that can perceive mathematics, that mathematics, which you admit is behind the universe and is quite remarkable. But does that give you pause that we have minds to actually recognize mathematics and the rationale of the universe?
I mean, it does give me pause in some sense. But math, at a deeper level, math gives me pause. Math gives me pause in the sense that it appears at least to be so deeply true. And it appears to be like the architecture from which the universe is made. But then by extrapolation, we are made, right? We are made then from that very math, if you will. And so in some sense, math is what enables our universe to be intelligible at all. And if we weren't able, even animals have rudimentary mathematical abilities, right? They've shown that dogs, my dogs are shepherds, and they can actually count to fairly high numbers because they needed to, right? To be shepherds, they count and they keep track of things. And I don't know if they count precisely. Actually, there are a lot of arguments out there right now about how unless you're trained in counting from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you actually tend to count in logarithmic scales, and so animals may count in logarithmic scales. But it doesn't surprise me that we as humans who have evolved and exist in a universe that is made intelligible by math have evolved to understand math, because that is sort of baked into evolution. But math itself, to me, is actually becomes really profound. And I think about this a lot. I don't, again, if you have a chance to pick up my book, please do. But, I talk about Euler's equation, or Euler's identity as it's known. And I don't know if you all are familiar with Euler's equation. It's one of, excellent. It's profound that this equation is true, and it's simple, and there's nothing left. Perfectly economical and beautiful, and relates all of these fundamental numbers that are fundamental to the universe in it. And for me, that equation itself is almost like a mystical experience that is indicating a truth that's deeper than we currently understand in terms of math. And so I think we have evolved to understand math to make the universe intelligible, but I think there is more math that we have not yet understood because we haven't needed it to survive and evolve.
So why are you going to the religious study? Are you going to be teaching in the religious studies department? What's the deal with it?
I mean, I have already done teaching in the religious studies department, and I'm collaborating with folks there on different things. It started out working with folks in religious studies on awe and how humans experience awe. And one posit was that the most profound experiences of awe often come through a spiritual or religious experience and or exposure to the universe. But it's evolved. I have deep interest in exotheology, which is, what would the existence of extraterrestrial life mean for higher power, or indeed how might extraterrestrial life perceive higher powers? I'm deeply interested in the ethics of outer space and how that is being driven by religious perspectives that have gotten entrained in Western culture, like the doctrine of discovery, that has turned into manifest destiny, that is now playing out in real time. And I don't know that we need to go down the political landscape right now, but I'm very, very worried about how our abilities, well, let me say corporate abilities and aspirations, are radically outpacing our ethical thinking, that I find incredibly alarming, and it's going to affect the long-term future of humanity. And all of that has religious undertones, and there are people in our religious studies department who think about this.
Well, here's what we really need, and here's our problem, is the brilliant astronomers like yourself, astrophysicists, don't know anything about Q or multiple attestation or New Testament scholarship. And this isn't learning calculus, which is beyond us, pretty much. You can go, are you familiar with Bart Ehrman, Dale Allison?
No.
Oh my God. So Bart Ehrman would be a good place to start. And if you read Dale Allison, you can see where you don't have to believe in the birth narratives, you don't have to believe in miracles, you don't have to believe in post-resurrection. You can just kind of not believe in anything and be a Christian. So But those are two good places to start. But when you talk to religious people, if you don't know Q and these things, then and is there a Q in astronomy too, which is kind of interesting. So if you could learn some basics, it would really help educate these Christians, because Christians don't know the most basic things. They couldn't put Jesus in history of
Just
their
buy
life.
her book.
So there is good reasons to believe Jesus did exist. He's historical, but Christians don't believe that. What they believe is their pastor's nonsense and what they've heard in their environment. They don't really know who they believe in, and it's really tragic.
Well, one of the things I've, I really do, I really have found my interactions with my colleagues in religious studies to be deeply valuable. And one of the conversations that often comes up, I know this is true of me, and I think it's true of, well, again, I want to say something that's not based in data. I suspect this is true of many people. You're brought up in a particular religious, often people are brought up in a particular religious tradition.
Oh, the outsider test of faith.
And you might ask them, so for example, I was brought up in one particular Protestant tradition. If you asked me how that, if you asked me if that was the right religion at the time, I would have said, yes, of course it is. If you had asked me how it was different than the other Protestant tradition over here, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I had no idea what the differences were. And so I think there's a lot of room for understanding on, I don't mean this to be a false dichotomy, but on both sides, if you will, right? I think scientists need to be much more sensitive to the limitations of science and the limitations of epistemology. But I think your lay religious person, this isn't to say like experts who deeply think about this, right? Of whom I'm sure many of you, are in that category. A typical general lay religious person doesn't necessarily know why their tradition holds the belief that they do, or why they do, or how it's different from other. And so I think there's really, the bottom line for me is there's a need for education and learning and curiosity all the way around. And I think it has to go up and down and sideways and diagonally in both directions.
Yeah, and they connect. To be a good apologist, you need to know the science and the New Testament and somewhat of the Old Testament, and stuff. But
it doesn't have to be an either or, right? If they are committed, as I infer that this group is, to finding our way to a truth, right? We have to be willing for it to not be an either or. It could be something in the middle.
But it's giving a good example. Have you heard of Hugh Ross?
Mm-hmm.
Old age creationist who gives all these brilliant fine-tuning, but he doesn't know the most basic thing about the Old Testament. He believes Daniel was written in the 6th century BC when, everybody knows it's like 167 or whatever. So the most basic things they can't get right. What drives me crazy is, in Genesis 6, Noah's flood. It's a blended narrative of the P&J writer. Almost nobody knows this. And you've got to know Hebrew. You got to know this stuff or at least know the basics to understand.
Please look up, if you don't know her work already. One of my dear friends and colleagues is, her name is Martine Helberson Taylor. And she is a Hebrew Bible scholar. And she has an audio book that came out a few years ago called Who Wrote the Bible? Writing the Bible? Something like that. But she gets into these dual perspectives in the Old Testament in a way that was very illuminating for me, and I didn't know. So
there's some great YouTubers out there. Paula G is probably the best. Myth Vision. These guys are doing a phenomenal job of bringing scholarship to the public, to the lay person, which before the ministers would never do it in a million years. They want to hide the truth from their lay people. So yeah, there is hope. But here's one of the problems is people don't read books anymore. They can barely get through a friggin' video. Let me
tell you, as a college professor, I am living that right now.
Yeah. And hey, Bill, by the way, I want to say thank you. I just hit bingo on my Bill Cluck bingo card. And this is a very exciting moment for me. And
thank you.
I just thank you for taking care of the whole line of the bingo card in almost one sentence. So
thank me, no Bill will say.
Brady, I'll say this. You were texting me saying,
Yes.
Everybody knows away from winning bingo, and at that moment he said, "Everybody knows," and bingo.
Oh my God.
This is so funny. You all are going to have to share this with me after.
Kelsey, it's in a really quickly. This is 6 years of Atheist Christian Book Club with Bill, and we love Bill. And Bill is a friend of ours. We hang out together. We have pizza. We talk and everything. And Bill calls me all the time. But this is 6 years of things that Bill says all the time in book club. And so Brady just made bingo cards, and so we played Bill Cluck Bingo.
And it seems like it's a play off of.
If you come back for another book, we'll get you a card.
Well, you can play if you come back next month. We'll give you a bingo.
Okay,
card.
we have not heard fish fry.
Yes, that's related to. Yeah, that's related to Jesus.
I only needed zombies.
Okay.
I was waiting for zombies.
Cards are different.
Will you read Bart Ehrman? You got to read Bart, just at least be familiar with him. Or when you talk to Christians, they're just going to have no respect for you. So read Bart Ehrman, Dale Allison, and tell us what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, our evening's getting away from us quickly, and the 3 things I've got to do. In a little bit, I want to talk about next month and who our guest author is, and I have a little video that Daniel put together. I'll let him narrate in just a second. But before I do that, John said he was asking for one
more quick one.
Question. It has to be true, false, something very quick.
Yes, thank you. Following your argument of always keeping a mind open and intellectual humility, you keep the possibility of saying it's possible could be a God, a theist God. If you were to go there, would it be a something or a someone or only a something?
My first reaction, so this is my gut visceral reaction to that, is that a something or a someone is a false dichotomy.
Okay.
It could be super personal, something beyond personal.
I feel like, we're so good at putting things into categories that we know of, but what about categories we don't know of? John, I don't have an answer for you, but that's my gut reaction when you asked that.
That's a good answer. It's all right. Just wanted to ask. I mean, I really respect the way you do this. So whatever you believe, I respect the way you do it.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Let me see if I can cue up this video that Daniel made for us. And
Kelsey, you'll have to
that a little bit, huh?
I want Kelsey to correct me on this because I've made this, Kelsey, for my atheist meeting that I'm having next week. I do a PowerPoint for the whole group, and so this is going to be part of the slide. But you can help me and tell me what's wrong with it because I'm sure there's something wrong with it.
Maybe I can tell you what's right with it.
Okay, well you could. Well, either way, I'll just tell you now.
It's a very pretty picture.
Okay, so alpha is the fine structure constant that is made up of these parts that you spoke about earlier. The square of the charge of the electron, and then below it in the denominator, 4 times pi, the permittivity of free space, which is the electric field's ability to pass through a vacuum, Planck's constant, the relation between energy of a photon and its frequency, and then the speed of light. And these components individually, you don't know where the values are coming from, but together, when you put these together in an equation, you get the fine structure constant. And what's fascinating to me, this is what's fascinating to me about it, is because these values are measured in units. So the electron charge is measured in coulombs, if you pronounce it coulombs. The permittivity of space is measured in meters per second. Planck's constant is joule seconds, and then speed of light is meters per second. But these all cancel out. The value, the units cancel out, and you're just left with this pure dimensionless number that appears in a variety of different places throughout in physics. And it's the dimensionless number that really kind of is the head scratcher. But the thing that was fascinating to me, and this is where I don't know if I'm exactly right or not, but the fine structure constant is also responsible for the spectral lines in the visible electromagnetic spectrum. So the different energy levels of electrons. This is how we see sodium, we see nitrogen, we see oxygen, and we see hydrogen. These are the marks that are as a result of the fine structure constant. But I think we had said it earlier, if you tweak the fine structure constant, that's it, James. If you tweak the fine structure constant just a little bit, the heavier elements start to disappear. The more you dial down the fine structure constant. But it's just fascinating how many different facets that this number, this value, is found in physics. Anyway, That's my narration of what I understand it from a layperson from the fine structure.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And I think I'll just caveat with this, and this is something we talked about when I interviewed you, that the mathematics. Now, I didn't become a Christian because of a fine tuning argument. I think I came to believe who Jesus was as an adult convert. I started to understand the Bible, but it was really Jesus as a person that was really integral and where I put my axiomatic trust. And then from there, I started investigating how all this would pertain to Jesus. But to me, I think, this is 30 years after I've been baptized. The fine structure constant seems to be, for me, a one thing that just seems to be the hallmark of a mind. And that's kind of where I'm at with it. Not to force you to conclude the same thing, but that to me is convincing evidence of a mind. Not, it doesn't get you to Christian theism. It just starts the basic argument from a purely physical perspective is that the numbers make me think that there's a mind behind them. What do you think? But anyway, did I get all that right?
Yeah, you're mostly there. That a couple things I would, and you have a lot of that right, and you understand a lot about the fine structure constant. The thing that gives me the most pause, and I think this might be one of those things that is not necessarily apparent to the outside world of physics, and I think it becomes hard to articulate, and physicists probably do a terrible job articulating it, is that in physics, one of the things we're always striving to do is put things in what are called dimensionless units, because it makes our lives a lot easier. And so the dimensionlessness of the fine structure constant actually doesn't give me pause. To me, it's a natural outcome of. In fact, if it had units, that would give pause, because that would mean it's just like an appendage dangling off that doesn't need to be there. And so in physics, having things that are dimensionless is actually normal. Now, just because it's normal doesn't mean that it doesn't signal some kind of a higher power. But to me, I don't go there. To me, it's it doesn't have dimensions because everything canceled out, and that's normal. So I don't quite make that step that you make.
Okay, no, it's interesting to hear your perspective on that, because I see people on different ends of the spectrum about how that combination of the units cancel themselves out. Some people are like, wow. Some people are like, so for me, I'm like, wow, that's weird. And it's weird because it's not just you get 1 over 137.03599 or whatever it is. This appears in other facets of physics. That is really what I think is the final head scratcher, that this number keeps appearing. The rest energy level of an electron in its lowest state is 137 times slower than the speed of light itself, which I thought that was pretty cool too.
Right.
But
right.
Thank you for your help and reaction to that. I was wanting to see what you would say.
No, I think I think what you're saying is really interesting. I think where the physicist in me sort of sees the fine structure as a natural outcome of how things are. And so I'm not quite willing to make that existential leap that you are.
Gotcha. All right.
But and also, if you tweak the fine structure constant, the spectral lines will shift, but they won't go away. So just keep that in mind. But that being said, we still don't know why it has the value that it does.
So that if you did fine structure constant, if you adjusted it, is there a percentage of adjustment before carbon disappears? What's the percentage of adjustment on that?
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and do the math on that, because it depends on a couple other factors. Because really what influences the elements you can have has to do with the strong force in the nuclei, because the strong force is what determines how hard it is for nuclei to stay bound, or not, and decay into other particles, and so that's a whole other kind of can of worms of physics that I think now, when it's almost 10 o'clock at night, I'm not prepared to do a mini lecture on the strong.
That's all right.
Yeah, I'd like to see you with your whiteboard next time, part 2.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to circle around real quickly before I talk about next month and your conversation with John. It reminds me of maybe 2 years ago, we had several discussions in the book club about what, when you come to a fork in the road, take it, as a joke go like that, is it how much of belief or trust? I think John preferred the word trust that you'd mentioned, but how much of that is volitional? It is that we have control, that we're going to make a decision. The Bible in places seems to make it appear that that is a decision. Choose you this day who you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But how much of it is volitional, that we do have a decision, and how much it's totally out of our control? Because you're talking about, you kind of wanted to believe in God and you couldn't find a place to do that. So it seems like the opposite. So how do you think that that's resolved? Is it something that we decided? Romans 1 that Bill was quoting also says that the problem is not that God is hidden. The problem is he's revealing himself, but we tend to suppress the truth in our own unrighteousness. And I find elements of that in my life because, I believe in God, but man, there's times that I tend to want to repress when I think God might be telling me something or leading me to something I don't want to do, that I will procrastinate or repress that. So it may just be part of the human condition. How much of it is volitional? How much of it is just a matter of your environment circumstances?
Well, now you're asking me psychology questions, which I'm surely not qualified to answer. But I can say from my own perspective, and I don't know how this might play out in actual like intellectual psychology conversations. There's a real, for me, what it comes down to is I can choose what I might, the information I can seek out. That is a choice I can make. I can choose, in some sense, to have a utilitarian confirmation bias, and that I ignore information of some kind and I input information from another kind. That is a choice I can make. I don't find that I can, as hard as I might try, choose to believe something. That is not a choice that I am able to make. Maybe there are other people who can. It's just not a choice I can make. And so because I have the luxury of not being forced to make a choice, at least not at this point in my life, I find that I can't. I wish that I could. I'm fascinated by people who can choose to believe things. And I'd love to know more about the psychology of that.
Well, I want everybody to hang with me for just a minute because I'm going to talk about next month. Real excited about our guest author, Michael Strauss, who's a particle physicist, Christian. We're going to talk about his book. But before I do, I just want to say thank you. I know it's late. You're an hour later than us, and you've been up and given us your time. Very, very interesting. You are not only knowledgeable, but also extremely entertaining. I could listen for another 2 or 3 hours, but we want to let you get back to your family. Thank you so much for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Is there any advice you have for us before you leave?
I think I don't have any advice. What you're doing is fabulous. I love how you interact with each other. I love how you listen to each other and exchange ideas. So I think that's great.
Thank you so much. And we hope we can have you back on in the future.
All right. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening and your graciousness.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Well,
Kelly.
we're going to give me just a second to pull it up and I'll let you know more about that. So start the broadcast and then over here there we go. All right. So there we go. Yes. Our guest author for March is going to be Dr. Michael Strauss. We've had him several times as a guest on our Apologetics Profile podcast. He's a friend. We see him at least once a year. It seems like at the big apologetics conference in New Orleans. He's received his undergraduate degree in physical science from Biola, his master's degree and PhD in experimental particle physics from the University of California, Los Angeles. He teaches now at the University of Oklahoma as the David Ross Boyd Professor of High Energy Particle Physics and spends part of his year researching at the CERN laboratory in Geneva analyzing data from the Atlas detector using the Large Hadron Collider. Dr. Strauss is a Christian, and we'll be discussing his 2019 book, The Creator Revealed: A Physicist Examines the Big Bang and the Bible. So this is kind of going along with the theme of tonight, and we're going to pick this up from a little different perspective from Dr. Strauss, and that's going to be the first Thursday of March. What's that, March 6th? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, March 6th. And so looking forward to having you guys back. Any final questions or comments from anyone?
James, we'll feature the, in lieu of, if you can't get the book or whatever, I'll give you the links, and we'll run the interview I just did with him. We interviewed Michael in New Orleans, along with Luke Barnes, together at the same table. So we'll put that link in the book club or wherever we're going to make it accessible, so you can listen to that conversation and get a feel for how Michael shares what he shares about particle physics. He was on the paper back in 2012 because Michael works at the Large Hadron Collider. He was on the discovery of the Higgs boson paper. He didn't share in the Nobel Prize, but his name's on the paper. But he's a super smart particle physicist. He can tell you everything about the minutia of the very small of the universe. But James, I'll send the links to you, and then you can use the links and to share them.
Okay. We always try to have, if you visit our Atheist Christian Book Club.com website, most of you get, I know, more likely to see our Facebook page, but if you go to the Atheist Christian Book Club.com, the next meeting has a load of information, biographical information, links to the book, but also links to video alternatives. If you don't have time to finish the book, we try to give some videos where the author is going to be discussing that. You can absorb it more quickly. So be sure to check that out and to get a head start. And I apologize, I was late getting the announcements out on this one and didn't give you guys as much time as usual to get the book read. But you will get extra credit if you read it after tonight. Go back and read Dr. Johnson's book. You will definitely enjoy it.
You get a pizza slice at James's house next time we meet.
Yes,
hey,
free
James.
pizza. Thanks so much.
Hey, James.
And Daniel,
Yeah.
you did a great job of interviewing her too. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you have, Ken?
I just wanted to recognize a relatively new face here, my cousin Randy Clark. He's been here at least once before, many years ago, and so I'm glad to see him here. He's a
Hi, Randy.
Christian believer, but we get along great. He's my favorite cousin, so that's who that is, Randy Clark.
Is he on camera right now?
Yeah, he's been on camera.
Okay, I didn't catch him. I'm not seeing everybody at the same time. Okay, well, anybody else that's new? I know Randy's not new. He's been here before when you did your book, but
You were muted, Randy. You have to unmute yourself for us to hear you.
oh, there you are. I see you now. Yeah, can you unmute, Randy?
Just on your screen on the upper right-hand corner.
In mine, it's the bottom left corner. So
There we go.
there. Okay, now.
Can you hear me
Hey,
now?
Randy. Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm not a techno guy. Ken responded, I got on and my wife called. And when I answered the phone, it kicked me off. And then I got back on and my son-in-law called me and I didn't answer. Ken texted me again. I didn't answer. I didn't want to get kicked off again, but I really enjoyed tonight. It was great. And Ken and I have been favorite cousins for our whole lives.
Mhm.
I'm a lot older than he is, but yeah, I have a lot of respect for him. And I really, and hey, Bill, by the way, I talked with you a lot when I was there back in September of 2018, and we were discussing Ken's book.
Yeah.
But good to see y'all. Good. I'll tune in again. I'll tune in again.
Thank you so
Super.
much for being part of the book.
Thanks, Randy.
I enjoyed it very much, and I'll get my tech cousin, to enlighten me on how to maneuver here.
Hey, we're
Hey,
still learning. We've been doing this for 6 years,
Ken?
and I'm still trying to figure it out.
I
Ken,
can't even get it unmuted.
Ken, if you're in town, it's next Wednesday at Madeline's in Plano. Bill's going to be there, but it'll be the All Atheist Club. I'm giving a presentation on Kelsey's book. So if you want to,
Oh, okay.
it's on Meetup in the Dallas Atheist Book Club in Meetup. And
Okay.
you have to RSVP because Keith will kick you out if you don't.
Okay. Good to know. I'm very interested. By the way, great job on snagging Dr. Johnson, Kelsey. I mean, I don't know how you found her, but she was a great guest. I loved having her.
I saw her on Michael Shermer, I think, and I was like, I found her book. Then I was like, okay, she must be doing the rounds. This is great because she had that.
She is, yeah.
She's like Sarah Salvi and her sister, and I know Sarah really well. So she was.
He lives up here in Altadena, where I live, close to Sierra Madre, Shermer.
Okay.
He's a really likable guy.
Yeah, he's kind of toned down since it's hardcore atheist days. He's gotten a little bit more like open to things, but yeah,
with Stephen Meyer a bit too. That may have had some.
Right. But for you, our Christian friends, be praying for me. Daniel will be going into the lion's den. I haven't been there in 8 months, and I was like, I told Bill, I said, I'm not going back unless they invite me back, because I had an issue with a gentleman there and I didn't want to cause problems. So I haven't been there since last June. But last month, Keith, the co-founder of the book club, hey, Dan, where you been? He called me on the phone. He said, hey, why don't you come on back? And okay. All right. So I picked a book and I'm leading the discussion, going to do a PowerPoint on what we just talked about. So I'm excited about that.
What's so funny? Can you guys hear me? What's so funny is they go and say, where have you been, Dan? They would care less if I ever come back. Nobody's ever called me and said, Bill, it's like, you haven't been here. Please stay away.
Hey, I texted you tonight,
Daniel
Bill.
has favor with this group. He must be doing something wrong, but I can't put my finger on it.
I am.
They like him. You know, they like him a lot, and they like to hear from him. And he is very conscientious about realizing this is their book club. He's not there to proselytize or to evangelize. He's there to really understand the book and try to present it. And I think they appreciate that. And I've only been to there a couple of times, but they do seem to like Daniel a lot.
Yeah, Daniel just gels with them. There's something about him that they are attracted to, and they just I don't know
what it is.
Yeah,
I have no idea, but I do a PowerPoint. There's a big TV in the dining room where we
do an excellent job, of course.
And it's I work a whole month on this PowerPoint. I get like 100 slides, and I have to talk for 2 hours. So
that's what I really appreciated with you and Dr. Johnson. You both confessed about the want for intellectual humility, how you have in the past competed, but you so modeled conversation, question and answer, allowing the other to define themselves and draw them out so we understand them better. I really respect that way of conversationally doing it. So.
Well, that's all the I owe that all to James and Brady and this book club. That's kind of where I got my feet wet and how I learned how to do that. And a lot of embarrassing. Well, thank you, John. It's a lot of embarrassing YouTube videos out there with me on there that I got
whatever it takes, man.
Face rubbed. Yeah, right. I got my face rubbed in it, but I
Kelsey was completely off of my radar, and Daniel was the one that said, "Oh, we really need that," and I wasn't totally convinced, but we needed an atheist author, so yeah, we'll go with that. But she was delightful. I mean, she was so easy to talk to and thoughtful, and it was.
But what's interesting is she won't make a friggin' commitment. I hate people like that.
But she explains why. I mean, I can get it. That's what
But if she's going to be an apologist, and she could, if she actually learned something at the religious studies department, she could be a really good apologist because she's very articulate and very likable. You know, a lot of,
You wanted to give us a real quick 1-minute update on the state of your shelf and the imminent collapse of your shelf.
Oh man, it's
Did we add some weight tonight?
Huh?
Did we add some weight tonight to your shelf?
Yeah. Well, the electromagnetic and strong nuclear forces, how they came about, which just to me seems very unlikely they'd come about by chance. Do you agree, Daniel?
I think, well, you know me, I'm thoroughly convinced that the mathematics is sufficient evidence. No, I didn't know any of this fine tuning business until I would say even just maybe 10 years ago. I've always been interested in the cosmos, but when really hit my stride with this fine tuning, when Luke's book came out in 2016. So it's been about 10 years that I've deep dived. And of course, and I wrote the book in 2018 with Paul. And but so it was in the last 10 years. So I didn't see this and become a Christian. I just see this as to me, I'm not sure, like with Kelsey, she demonstrated this. This is what I see a lot. People that aren't Christians, they're not moved by this as an argument for God. They're just not. And so to me, for me as an apologist and a Christian personally, I think stuff like this is, you can call it confirmation bias if you want to, but for me, it's further confirmation. It helps to solidify what I believe. Now, you may think I'm looking for things to confirm what I believe, but to me, mathematics just hanging there in space, you bring it all together and you get this stuff. To me,
but Dan, it's not like when you went and presented such strong evidence for God at the book club, it's not like they're going to go, Daniel, can you lead me to Christ? I mean, like, or
you know,
tell me the fourth law. I mean,
no,
it's not like that. Why?
Well, you know, and I understand that perspective. I've seen this so many times over and over again that I'm finally comfortable in a room like that because I'm not responsible for their responses to that.
Right.
I present
Hey, Bill, real quick, while we got you here, and the rest of the club might want to know who's left in the room with us, but it was surreal almost. But in New Orleans last month, Luke Barnes was there. He's one of the plenary speakers.
Right.
And it was just like so weird because, you know, you've been Zooming with him in Australia. You know, we've had him as a guest long distance for the book club, etc. But for him to be in New Orleans, it just seems like he shouldn't even be in this part of the world, you know. And it was
right.
He was asking about you, and
I appreciate it.
He really wishes you the best in your journey. Because he believes you are.
Well, James, you've given lots of talks on Romans 1:18. First of all, and Daniel, are the atheists at the book club, are they suppressing the truth? And well, you've heard Kelsey say she isn't suppressing the truth.
Well, and I think James said it, and I'll say the same thing. I'll echo what James said. It's not me. This is, I agree with scripture, but this is an indictment upon all of humanity. This is what we do. I know people don't like it. I don't like it, but we all, according to scripture, and I know some people don't find the Bible to be authoritative or anything to that capacity, but I think that is something. Now let's take it out of the realm of God's existence for a second and look at the wider picture of culture in general. Do people suppress truth? And it doesn't even have to do with religion.
Of course, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's a hobby in politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the cultural map that people suppress truth. So I think it's not a far step to just say, well, why wouldn't we do this with God? The same thing. That's just human nature. It's our what I believe is our sin, the noetic effects of sin on our mind. That if we're already prone to suppress the truth, especially when it's unpleasant about anything. You know?
No, that makes sense.
So
Ken,
I think,
Ken, do you think atheists are suppressing the truth?
You weren't listening.
Suppressing the truth already.
What Dan says is true, that everybody has areas where we, whether subconsciously or not, suppress. I don't think it's usually conscious.
Yeah, I don't think it's you're aware of it to that extent. I just think that's a God's eye view on all of us.
Can I interject something here real quick?
Sure.
Religion or whatever.
Well, as a Calvinist, people suppress the truth, Bill.
Yeah.
It was foreordained.
And you know I'm not a Calvinist.
Okay, well, even as a non-Calvinist.
No, Phil's quite the opposite.
I think sometimes there's kind of a misconception about Romans 1, because Romans 1, if you read it carefully, you'll notice that Romans 1 doesn't say all human beings suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What it says is that the wrath of God is being poured out upon human beings who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And I had Richard Suttles on my podcast several months ago as a guest, and the topic was the Romans 1 gun. And there are apologists out there who are using Romans 1 as a gun to shoot at atheists and say, see, all atheists suppress the truth and unrighteousness, but that's actually not what the text says. And so I think it can be a big mistake for apologists to suggest that anyone who doesn't believe in God doesn't believe in God because they're suppressing the truth. It's just that it's very common for people to suppress the truth, but there are some non-resistant non-believers out there. And if that's the case, then I think Christian apologists should try to avoid shooting the Romans 1 gun at every atheist or every non-believer out there.
Yeah, and I'll second that. I think that even if it is true, even if we grant that everybody is suppressing the truth, to be shouted at and to have that used as a hammer or a gun, as you say, doesn't really get you. I mean, people don't respond to that attack.
Well, that's why
Exactly.
I'm with James in the sense that if I'm going to talk about that, I'm going to make sure that to some degree I'm putting myself in that. And I agree with you, Phil, that the context says that the wrath of God is being poured out on those. Yes, but I think also too, so contextually, I totally agree with that. But I always try to make sure that I'm not using the gun and softening the blow by saying, look, I've done this. I understand what it is. And I'm not saying that I'm not doing that and you are. That's what I want to avoid.
Just real quick, if I can sneak in one more question without asking for a little feedback from apologetic point of view. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say now. Sorry. The squirrels.
Well, James, you've reached on it. Are people suppressing the truth? Are all atheists?
I think it's a human condition. It's not atheists are doing it and Christians aren't. I think every human being does it, and it's one of those, like the confirmation bias. You probably are pretty unaware of it until you begin to see elements in your own life, and you go, hey, I'm the guy. I'm the one doing it right here.
Hey, I suppress the truth in my unrighteousness. If you don't believe me, I can get my wife to come in here.
she can give you a list of them, right?
Yep.
But when I asked that question,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well,
Go ahead, John.
One, it says the invisible attributes, which is kind of interesting. We discovered dark matter and dark energy only recently in the Bible.
Well, I think the invisible attributes, what they're talking about, are beauty, truth, goodness, love, mercy.
Okay.
Yeah. Not
John, did you remember your question?
Yeah, it was, I listened to her, and I don't know enough about natural theology. I'm learning, but you're trying to reason your way up to God, which I think is the kind of the context of Romans 1, maybe. But when I listen to people like the doctor who balance both views fairly well, at some point you keep getting up higher and higher. You're never going to get to God. God's got to reveal himself. And the way I personalize that is I can know there's a person in the room, but unless I engage with them and converse with them, I don't really begin to know them.
I began to ask the question, but didn't follow up. I would love to hear more, and I know she's reluctant to go into a lot of depth, but more about her transition away from Christianity. I know she did her graduate work at University of Colorado. Boulder is a tough place to try to have any kind of Christianity survive the campus experience, if that's where she was. And I would like to know part of that story.
Well, she did say one thing in her, I think it was with Shermer or with Daniel, about it not just having a life where you pray more, do more, all the more and more, but God is either personal and real or he isn't. I mean,
yeah, John, I think this is kind of how I picture it, because to some degree I understand exactly where Kelsey's coming from in terms of I'd like to believe, but I can't choose to believe something that I don't believe. So and to your point about, her points about doing more, and religion being a thing that you do. Like we at Watchman, we study cults, and cults are all about doing things.
Right.
And I'm not saying that Christianity doesn't have its things that should be manifest in the life of a believer. But the difference is we're talking between justification, God justifying you, and God sanctifying you through a learned obedience over your lifetime. So, but the cults mix this. They confuse doing things with justification. Mm-hmm. So what I tell people, and if I had another minute with Kelsey, I'd tell her the same thing. I said, Christianity is not about, in terms of the justification, that happens to you. You can't climb up and attain justification by your own merits. This is the line between a cult, every other cult and religion in the world, and Christianity, a big red line.
I understand that distinction perfectly. I grew up in it, and yet I completely identify with what she says about, if I could believe, I would, but it just doesn't. It doesn't ring true. If it doesn't ring true, it doesn't ring true. You can't change that.
Right. And so I think
that's come up is if God really wanted me to be a believer, he would know what evidence and would provide that I need to see, and he hasn't. So
like Paul, Paul,
divine hiddenness
or whatever.
But Ken, you actually, I think you alluded to something earlier, and I think it's very important when we talk about Romans 1 and natural theology, because I asked Richard Suttles, if I shot you with the Romans 1 gun, is that going to have any appeal for you? Is that going to increase your chances of considering the possibility that Christianity is true? And he said, of course not. So even if the Bible did say that, I don't think that Paul is going around saying, hey, everybody, I want you to lead with this in your evangelism efforts.
Well, what I hear, I'm sure this is not intended, but sometimes what I hear when I hear that coming from a believer who insists that that's the case with me, I hear them say, well, Ken, I know your thoughts better than you know your own thoughts. And your own thoughts, you're not being truthful about what you actually believe, because if you were being truthful, you would say you do recognize and believe that God exists. And I know my own thoughts that that's not the case.
Yeah,
right?
and
So,
the atheists that they're
calling me a liar.
Right, exactly. The atheists that they are engaging with in these debates are saying, you don't know what I am thinking. You don't know what, and I just think that it is such a poor tactic.
Is it mostly
I would
presuppositional approaches that you're seeing that?
Yes, it is. It is almost always presuppositional apologists who use the Romans 1 gun and who shoot the non-believer with it. And that's one reason why I don't like presuppositional apologetics.
This is quickly turning into an after party. So
yes,
let's hold all these good thoughts and ideas. Thanks so much for being part of the club. I really enjoyed tonight, and we'll see you guys next month.
Thank y'all.
See you next time.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.